You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon, and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly made a decision that would forever change the landscape of the Middle East. They voted in favor of a plan to divide the British Mandate of Palestine into two separate states, one for Arabs and the other for Jews, with the city of Jerusalem standing as a special international zone. This decision was met with jubilation in Jewish communities, but sparked anger across the Arab world. Tensions in Palestine quickly escalated into violence, leading to a cycle of attack and retaliation. The British, who had control over the area, stayed out of the conflict, which quickly spiraled into a fierce civil war. By the beginning of the next year, the violence had become more organized, involving the Arab Liberation Army and volunteers led by Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini from Egypt. This army managed to isolate Jerusalem's 100,000 Jewish residents by blocking supply convoys, which eventually led to severe shortages and loss of life. Jewish forces tried to break the blockade but faced significant losses, including nearly all of their armored vehicles. In areas like the isolated Negev and northern Galilee, Jewish settlements were in a dire situation. As this conflict unfolded, up to 100,000 Arabs from key cities and Jewish-dominated regions moved away due to the growing insecurity. This wave of displacement, along with the deteriorating situation, led the United States to withdraw its support for the partition plan, emboldening the Arab League's opposition. Meanwhile, the British threw their support behind Transjordan's annexation of the Arab part of Palestine. Despite facing setbacks, David Ben-Gurion restructured the Jewish Defense Forces, mandating military training for all men and women, and securing crucial arms deals with the help of funds raised by Golda Meir and support from Stalin. These efforts significantly boosted the Jewish military capability, setting the stage for a series of offensive operations to secure key areas and lift the siege of Jerusalem. In a notable operation, forces managed to open a route to Jerusalem, bringing essential supplies to the city's Jewish population. This success was partly due to Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini's death in combat. During this period, violent acts such as the massacre at Deir Yassin by Jewish irregular forces deeply affected the Arab population and contributed to a mass exodus. Key victories by Jewish forces led to the capture of mixed areas and further displacement of Palestinian Arabs. With the British essentially out of the picture, neighboring Arab states were unprepared to change the outcome of the conflict. King Abdullah I of Transjordan, hoping to annex more territory, was in secret talks with both sides, complicating the political landscape. As the stage was set for an all-out battle for Jerusalem, and with the territory's future hanging in the balance, Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel on May 14, 1948. This marked the beginning of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which saw the intervention of the armies of the surrounding Arab state. By September of 1947, the Haganah had amassed an inventory of 10,489 rifles, 702 light machine guns, 2,666 submachine guns, 186 medium machine guns, 672 2-inch mortars, and 92 3-inch 76mm mortars. Facing the likely scenario of having to defend themselves against Palestinian Arabs in the neighboring Arab states, Ben-Gurion spearheaded a secretive yet significant campaign to acquire arms in the West, starting in 1946. This campaign enabled the Yishuv to secretly gather military equipment and arms abroad to be transferred to Palestine once the British blockade ended. In the United States, Yishuv representatives successfully purchased 3 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, with one bombing Cairo in July 1948, some Curtiss C-46 commando transport planes, and numerous half-tracks cleverly disguised as agricultural equipment. Over in Western Europe, Haganah agents collected 50 65mm French mountain guns, 12 120mm mortars, 10 H-35 light tanks, and a significant number of half-tracks. Purchases from Czechoslovakia included 25 Avia S-199 fighters, a less advanced version of the Messerschmitt Bf-109, 200 heavy machine guns, 5,021 light machine guns, 24,500 rifles, and 52 million rounds of ammunition, marking a significant armament boost, although leaving them short of heavy weaponry. The aerial smuggling operations, named Operation Balak, were spearheaded by American pilots, Jews and non-Jews alike, with Al Schwimmer, an ex-U.S. Air Transport Command flight engineer, leading the way. This operation included acquiring and training fighter pilots such as Lou Lenart, who led the first Israeli air assault against the Arabs. Several Americans, including Schwimmer, faced prosecution by the U.S. government for violating the Neutrality Act of 1939 due to their involvement in these operations. Concerning arms production, the Yishuv boasted a relatively advanced arms-producing capacity, generating 3 million 9mm bullets, 150,000 Mills grenades, 16,000 submachine guns, Sten guns, and 210 3-inch 76mm mortars between October 1947 and July 1948, in addition to developing and manufacturing several Davidka mortars, notable for their loud explosions despite their inaccuracy. The Ayalon Institute, a hidden bullet factory under Kibbutz Ayalon, played a crucial role in this production effort, producing approximately 2.5 million bullets for Sten guns, ensuring that ammunition was never in short supply during the war. Following Israel's independence, these covert manufacturing operations were relocated above ground, with the Haganah's arms production centralized into what later became Israel Military Industry. In terms of manpower, by November 1947, the Haganah was a well-structured underground paramilitary force that had evolved into a national force, with experiences stretching from the Arab riots of 1920-21 through the 1929 riots, the Great Uprising of 1936-39, to World War II. It comprised a mobile force, the Hish, with 2,000 full-time fighters, men and women, and 10,000 reservists, all between the ages of 18 and 25, alongside an elite unit, the Palmach, consisting of 2,100 fighters and 1,000 reservists. Additionally, it had a garrison force, the Haim Hail Mishmar, made up of individuals over 25. Overall, the Yishuv's total strength hovered around 35,000, including 15,000 to 18,000 fighters and a roughly 20,000-strong garrison force. Thousands of men and women who had served in the British Army during World War II added valuable military experience, even though they didn't join the underground militias. The Yishuv also benefited from the Jewish settlement police, numbering about 12,000, the Gadna youth battalions, and armed settlers, further bolstering their forces. Despite the late start in training by December 1947, by the end of March, 21,000 individuals had been conscripted, with further call-ups increasing the numbers. By March 1948, the Yishuv had a notable numerical superiority, with a total of 35,780 mobilized fighters for the Haganah, 3,000 men under Lehi and Irgun, and additional armed settlers, with Irgun eventually being absorbed into the Jewish Defense Army. The British intelligence, MI5, noted that Irgun had been involved or implicated in numerous acts of terrorism during the twilight years of the British Mandate in Palestine, including attacks on trains and the abduction of British servicemen. On the Arab side, by the end of 1947, there was already a significant respect, mixed with apprehension, for the Yishuv's military capability among the Palestinians, who anticipated defeat in the event of conflict. Following the outbreak of violence in Jerusalem on November 29, the Arab Higher Committee acknowledged their limited armaments by calling for a 3-day strike. The most militant Palestinian group in the city, consisting of 44 fighters, was equipped with just 12 rifles, a few handguns, and several kilograms of explosives. The estimated numbers of Arab combatants vary, with some historians listing an increase to 12,000, while others suggest an eventual total Arab strength roughly equal to that of the Yishuv, at approximately 23,500 troops. However, as Israel mobilized a significant portion of its able citizens, in contrast to the Arabs who only mobilized a small fraction of a much larger population, the Yishuv's strength steadily and significantly increased throughout the conflict. During the war, the goals of the Yishuv, which refers to the Jewish community in Palestine, evolved. Initially, their main goal was quite straightforward: to withstand attacks from both Palestinian Arabs and surrounding Arab states. This was a time when Zionist leaders were profoundly worried about the possibility of a tragedy similar to the Holocaust occurring in the Middle East, a fear that was exacerbated by the inflammatory rhetoric of their Arab adversaries. As the conflict continued, new objectives emerged. One of these was to expand the Jewish state's borders beyond those outlined by the United Nations. This expansion was initially focused on incorporating isolated Jewish settlements, but later grew to include acquiring additional territories to secure defensible borders. Another objective that developed after a few months of fighting was to minimize the number of potentially hostile Arab residents within Israel, whom they viewed as a threat from within. Researcher Shea Hazkani found evidence that some of Israel's political and military leadership, including Ben-Gurion and certain religious Zionist leaders, likened the war to biblical battles, advocating for ruthless measures against their enemies. This sentiment was reflected in pamphlets distributed to Israeli Defense Forces recruits, which conveyed a message of merciless retaliation against any harm inflicted upon them. A specific plan known as Plan Dalet, or Plan D, crafted by the Haganah, a Jewish paramilitary group and the precursor to the Israel Defense Forces, between the autumn of 1947 and spring of 1948, has been a point of contention among historians. Some argue it was defensive in nature, while others, like Walid Khalidi, Ilan Pappé, and Yoav Gelber, interpret the plan as an attempt to conquer as much of Palestine as possible and forcibly remove its Arab inhabitants. Ilan Pappé, in particular, labels it as a strategy for ethnic cleansing. Benny Morris provides a contrasting view, suggesting there was no explicit intent for mass expulsion. The plan did outline how to deal with resistance, expelling the population in case of resistance or placing them under military rule if no resistance was encountered. Faced with the threat of an Arab invasion, the Yishuv prepared for the worst, given they had limited information on the real military capabilities of their Arab neighbors. They took the threats and propaganda from the Arab side seriously, believing their very existence was at stake. The Arab League, representing Arab nations, was unanimously against the United Nations proposal to divide Palestine into distinct Jewish and Arab states. Initially, the League supported Palestine's right to become an independent nation, yet they also prevented a Palestinian government from forming. As 1947 was coming to an end, they set up a military committee led by retired Iraqi General Ismail Safwat. His task was to evaluate if the Palestinians could win a fight against the Jews. Safwat's report wasn't hopeful. He believed victory was impossible without the help of Arab nations' official armies. Despite his recommendations, the League chose to back armed resistance to the UN partition plan without involving their military forces directly. By April, faced with the reality of Palestinian defeat, an influx of refugees, and pressure from their own citizens, Arab leaders made the decision to move their forces into Palestine. They justified their invasion, citing three main reasons: to bring back law and order, to fill the power vacuum left by the end of the British mandate over Palestine, and their belief that the only real solution was to establish a unified Palestinian state. British diplomat Alec Kirkbride shared a revealing conversation in his 1976 memoirs with Azam Pasha, the Secretary General of the Arab League. Just a week before the invasion, when Kirkbride asked Pasha about the Jewish military strength, Pasha responded dismissively, claiming that no matter the number, we will sweep them into the sea. Historian Gelber has pointed out that the Arab states were somewhat reluctantly pulled into the war by the failure of the Palestinian Arabs and the Arab Liberation Army. They were primarily motivated by a desire to prevent the total collapse of the Palestinians and to avoid the influx of even more refugees into their countries. They believed that without their intervention, no Arab force in Palestine would have been capable of halting the advances of the Haganah, the main Jewish military force at the time. King Abdullah was at the helm of the Arab Legion, recognized as the most formidable Arab force in the conflict of the time, according to historians Eugene Rogan and Avi Shleim in 2007, although Morris in 2008 did view the Egyptian army as more potent. The Arab Legion boasted around 10,000 troops under the leadership of British officers. In the lead-up to 1946 to 1947, Abdullah openly claimed he wouldn't stand in the way of Palestine being partitioned and a Jewish state being established. While he ideally wanted to take over all of Palestine, he was open to a compromise. His idea of a compromise involved supporting the division if the area designated for an Arab state in the West Bank could be joined with Jordan. In secretive talks with the Jewish Agency, with Golda Meir among the representatives, they reached an understanding. The Jews would not oppose Jordan's move to annex the West Bank, despite Abdullah's unmet hope to also gain Mediterranean access through the Negev Desert. In return, Jordan would not assault the forthcoming Jewish state as outlined in the United Nations partition plan, which also marked Jerusalem as an international zone, not belonging to either state. Desperate to keep British backing, Abdullah vowed not to strike at the Jewish state. However, Abdullah found himself squeezed by nearby Arab nations to join an all-out Arab offensive against the nascent state of Israel, a maneuver he used to salvage his standing in the Arab domain amid doubts about his connections with Western and Jewish figures. Despite earlier promises, Jordan's guarantees were skeptically received. Tawfiq Abu al-Huda indicated to the British on the war's eve that Jordan would join the fight against Israel if other Arab forces did. On May 23rd, Abdullah informed the French consul in Amman of his commitment to combat Zionism and thwart the creation of an Israeli state next to his kingdom. Abdullah's influence in the 1948 conflict was pivotal. He considered himself the supreme commander of the Arab forces and persuaded the Arab League to officially assign him this role. His leadership aimed to align the Arab military efforts with his political ambitions. King Farouk of Egypt was really worried about King Abdullah of Jordan getting too much recognition as the leading figure in the Arab world, especially concerning the situation in Palestine. Farouk didn't want this because he had his own aspirations to be seen as the top leader in the Arab world, and he also wanted to take control of the southern part of Palestine for Egypt. Gamal Abdel Nasser noted that the Egyptian Ministry of Defense initially described their military actions in Palestine as merely a way to discipline the Zionist gangs. This term was frequently used in reports by the Haganah to refer to Palestinian fighters. A study from 2019 revealed that top British spies, military officials, and diplomats in Cairo secretly encouraged King Farouk to join the war effort against Israel, even though the British government was unaware and did not approve of this plan. On another front, Nouri as-Said from Iraq had grand ambitions to unite the entire Fertile Crescent, encompassing a large area of the Middle East, under Iraqi leadership. Syria and Lebanon were also interested in parts of northern Palestine for themselves. Owing to these varied ambitions, there was a significant lack of trust. The various Arab leaders doubted the Palestinian leaders who advocated for an independent Palestinian state, and they also mistrusted one another. This skepticism resulted in minimal cooperation among the Palestinian factions and the Arab armies during the war. Amid these tensions, rumors began circulating that King Abdullah was secretly negotiating with Israel again, as he had previously done with the Jewish Agency. This prompted the Arab League, led by Egypt, to take action by forming the All-Palestine government in Gaza on September 8th. This new government was nominally led by the Mufti, but its true purpose was to contest Abdullah's influence. Abdullah responded firmly, ensuring that any armed factions operating within the territories his troops controlled were dismantled. Glub Pasha, a leading figure in Abdullah's forces, executed these orders with strictness and efficiency. Despite the fact that Israel was up against the powerful armies from neighboring Arab countries, by mid-May, Palestinians themselves barely had a military presence due to losses in earlier conflicts. Both British intelligence and the Military Committee of the Arab League had reached similar findings about this situation. Interestingly, officials from the British Foreign Ministry and the Central Intelligence Agency were of the opinion that, should a conflict break out, the Arab states were more likely to emerge victorious. Military historian Martin van Creveld points out that when it came to manpower, both sides were somewhat equally matched. In a bold claim made in May, Egyptian generals assured their leadership that invading Israel would be akin to a parade without any risk, predicting that Tel Aviv would fall within just 2 weeks. Notably, Egypt, Iraq, and Syria all boasted air forces, with Egypt and Syria also equipped with tanks, and all 3 countries possessing some modern artillery. On the other side, initially, the Haganah, the main Jewish military force at the time, lacked heavy machine guns, artillery, armored vehicles, and had no anti-tank or anti-aircraft defenses, military aircraft, or tanks. When the Arab armies from Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and one other country invaded on May 15th, their military capabilities significantly surpassed those of the Haganah units they first went up against. A particularly telling moment came on May 12th, just 3 days before the invasion, when David Ben-Gurion, Israel's founding prime minister, was briefed by his top military advisors. Despite taking into account that these advisors had likely overestimated the size and efficiency of the Arab armies, as much as the Arab generals might have overestimated the strength of the Jewish fighters, they concluded that Israel's odds of winning in a conflict against the Arab states were only about 50-50. When looking at how well armed the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, was by the end of the British Mandate, there is some disagreement among historians. Ephraim Karsh points out that before they received help from Czechoslovakia through something called Operation Balak, there was approximately 1 weapon for every 3 fighters. The elite Palmach forces could only equip 2 out of every 3 members. Larry Collins and Dominique Lapierre noted that by April of 1948, the Haganah, the main Jewish military force, had managed to gather only about 20,000 rifles and Sten guns for an on-paper force of 35,000 soldiers. On the other hand, Walid Khalidi mentioned that these forces were actually well stocked with arms. Adding to their arsenal, France even allowed Air France to fly cargo directly to Tel Aviv on May 13th. Initially, the Yishuv's forces were organized into 9 brigades. After Israel declared independence, these forces expanded to 12 brigades. Both sides increased their numbers in the first few months of the conflict, but Israeli forces grew especially due to the full mobilization of their society and the arrival of around 10,300 immigrants each month. By the end of 1948, the Israel Defense Forces boasted 88,033 soldiers, including 60,000 on the front lines. The French played a significant role too. They allowed Czech arms shipments, intended for Israel, to pass through France on their way and authorized 2 shipments to Nicaragua, which were actually for Israel. Czechoslovakia itself sent a lot of support, including thousands of rifles, machine guns, and millions of rounds of ammunition, not to mention fighter aircraft like the Avia S-199. Before the blockade lifted at the end of the mandate, the Haganah had amassed an impressive collection of weapons in Western Europe, including tanks and half-tracks, and was ready to ship these arms on 12 cargo ships. Post-independence, the Israelis showcased their resourcefulness by constructing 3 Sherman tanks from materials found in abandoned British depots. They also acquired British weapons, taking advantage of the chaos during the British withdrawal and some corrupt officials. Just before the last British forces left Haifa, 2 British soldiers, sympathetic to the Israeli cause, even stole 2 Cromwell tanks and joined the IDF, laying the groundwork for the Israeli Armored Corps. By July 1948, after the first truce, Israel had set up an air force, a navy, and a tank battalion. After the second truce, they received Supermarine Spitfire fighter planes from Czechoslovakia. These planes were sneaked into Israel using a deserted Luftwaffe runway in Yugoslavia, with the Yugoslav government's consent, as part of the broader Operation Balak, which included those crucial airborne arms smuggling missions from Czechoslovakia. When the conflict began, along with Palestinian militia groups, the 5 Arab countries that entered the war were Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, which sent their regular army forces into battle. They were joined by additional troops from Saudi Arabia and Yemen. On the night before the war started, it was estimated that the Arab forces ready to fight numbered between 23,500 and 26,500. This included 10,000 from Egypt, 4,500 from Jordan, 3,000 from Iraq, between 3,000 and 6,000 from Syria, 2,000 volunteers from the Arab Liberation Army, 1,000 from Lebanon, and a few hundred from Saudi Arabia, not to forget the Palestinian irregulars already on the ground. These troops had the advantage of training by British and French military instructors, particularly Jordan's Arab Legion, which was led by Lieutenant General Sir John Glubb, also known as Glubb Pasha. Interestingly, Syria had attempted to buy a bunch of small arms for the Arab Liberation Army from Czechoslovakia, but this plan was foiled when the Haganah intervened, stopping the shipment. Jordan's Arab Legion was the standout among the Arab forces. This legion, numbering between 8,000 and 12,000, was well equipped thanks to the support and training from British officers, and had about 40 artillery pieces and 75 armored cars at its disposal. Until January 1948, it even had extra support from the 3,000-strong Transjordan Frontier Force. Under the leadership of Glubb Pasha, and with up to 48 British officers, the Arab Legion entered the war in May 1948, focusing their efforts on securing the West Bank and East Jerusalem for Jordan. France played a significant role by blocking a major arms sale to Ethiopia, which was actually intended for Egypt and Jordan. It also denied a British request to land a squadron destined for Transjordan on its territory and pressured Belgium to halt arms sales to Arab states. The Jordanian forces stood out for their training among all the combatants, whereas others struggled with strategic and tactical decision-making. This was evident in the placement of the 4th Regiment at Latrun, a position left by Arab Liberation Army combatants and not fully appreciated by the Haganah for its strategic importance, eventually coming to play a crucial role in the control of Jerusalem. As for Iraq, in 1948, it had a sizable army of 21,000 men and a fleet of 100 mostly British planes. Initially, Iraq contributed about 3,000 men to fight, including infantry and armored units, under Jordanian strategic guidance. Egypt, on its part, was capable of deploying a maximum of around 40,000 soldiers, though 80% of its military-age males were unfit for service. Its initial expeditionary force sent to Palestine numbered 10,000, led by Major General Ahmed Ali al-Muawi, and included a mix of infantry, armored units, and artillery, despite a limited logistical capability for supporting operations beyond its borders. The Egyptian Air Force boasted over 30 Spitfires and some bombers at time. Syria entered the war with 12,000 soldiers, composed of infantry and a small armored division, plus a fleet of 50 planes, including 10 from World War II. Despite existing contracts, France decided to halt arms sales to Syria. Lebanon's army was the smallest, with only 3,500 soldiers. An early agreement with the Maronite religious leaders kept Lebanon's military participation minimal, with only a token force engaging in northern Galilee. This strategic non-involvement was broken when Israeli forces moved into southern Lebanon until the war's end. By the time of the second truce, Egypt had significantly increased its forces in the field. The Iraqis also upped their contribution, eventually reaching around 18,000 men. Saudi Arabia's involvement included hundreds of volunteers, initially gathering near Aqaba to invade the Negev, but ultimately joining the Egyptian command and facing heavy conflict including air bombardments and a land assault, leading up to their withdrawal following an armistice in February 1949. During the first truce, Sudan also contributed with 6 companies of troops fighting alongside the Egyptians. Yemen and Morocco provided smaller contingents, adding to the diverse Arab forces committed to the conflict. In a last-ditch effort to prevent disaster, several Arab leaders quietly requested the British to extend their stay in Palestine for at least one more year. The conflict within Mandatory Palestine escalated into a full-scale war between newly formed states when Israel declared its independence on May 14, 1948, just hours before the British mandate was scheduled to expire at midnight. The very next day, armies from neighboring Arab countries, including Egypt, Transjordan, and Syria, crossed into the territories earmarked for an Arab state by the United Nations Partition Plan, effectively invading the former Palestinian mandate. From April 1st to May 14th, Zionist forces had executed 8 out of 13 major military operations outside the area designated for a Jewish state, according to Plan Dalet. Yigal Allon, the operational commander, mentioned that without the Arab invasion, the Haganah forces would have expanded to the natural borders of western Israel. The Arab incursion was criticized by major international players like the United States, the Soviet Union, and United Nations Secretary-General Trygve Lie, though it did receive backing from the Republic of China and some other United Nations member states. The original strategy for the Arab forces involved a pincer movement. Syrian and Lebanese forces were to come from the north, while Jordanian and Iraqi forces would attack from the east, aiming to meet at Nazareth before pushing towards Haifa. The Egyptians, meanwhile, were tasked with advancing to capture Tel Aviv. However, at a meeting in Damascus from May 11th to 13th, Abdullah of Jordan opposed this plan, which favored Syrian interests, arguing instead for a strategy more aligned with his goal of taking over the land set aside for an Arab state in the partition plan, while pledging not to attack the land allocated to the Jewish state. Furthermore, Lebanon withdrew from the conflict at the last minute, influenced by Christian opposition and alleged Jewish bribes. French consulate intelligence in Jerusalem provided on May 12, 1948, about the invading Arab forces and their tactical adjustments was crucial to Israel's successful defense against the invasion. The primary goal for Jewish forces was to defend against the superior Arab military advantages in firepower and initiative. With the British no longer obstructing Jewish immigration and arms shipments, the Haganah, along with smaller groups like Irgun and Lehi, gradually evolved from a paramilitary group into a formidable army, bolstered by an influx of immigrants and weaponry. On May 26, 1948, Israel unified these groups under the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, creating a centralized military command. In 1948, the Egyptian army, which was the largest of the Arab forces, made its move from the south. On May 15th, they targeted 2 Israeli settlements, Nirim and Kfar Daram, with a heavy arsenal including artillery, armored vehicles, and in Kfar Daram's case, also tanks and aircraft. But despite their superior firepower, the Egyptians were unable to overcome the settlement's defenders, who were fewer in number and not as well armed but put up a tough fight. A few days later, on May 19th, the Israelis faced another severe challenge at Yad Mordechai, where just about 100 defenders armed with basic weapons bravely stalled a massive Egyptian force of 2,500 soldiers, backed by tanks, artillery, and aircraft for 5 days. Despite the odds, these defenders managed to inflict significant casualties on the Egyptians while keeping their own losses relatively low. The Egyptian force split into 2 main groups, with one pushing north along the coast through what's now the Gaza Strip and the other heading east towards Beersheba. They also targeted several kibbutzim in the Negev region to protect their flank, including Kfar Daram, Nirim, Yad Mordechai, and Negba. The Israeli defenders of these places fought valiantly for days against a much stronger enemy, successfully delaying them and allowing the Israeli Givati Brigade time to prepare to defend Tel Aviv. On May 28, the Egyptians tried to push north again, but were stopped by a damaged bridge north of Istud. Although the Givati Brigade spotted them, no immediate action was taken to block their path. The Egyptians could have continued towards Tel Aviv unopposed, but they didn't take the opportunity. Then, from May 29 to June 3, in what's known as Operation Pleshet, Israel halted the Egyptian advance northward. This operation saw Israel's new Air Force's first combat mission, where they used 4 Avia S-199 planes to attack an Egyptian armored column. Despite technical difficulties and losing 2 planes, their attack successfully disrupted the Egyptians, who lost their momentum after regrouping. This was followed by continuous Israeli bombardments and small-scale harassments, culminating in a significant shift in momentum toward Israel as Egypt moved from an offensive to a defensive strategy. However, on June 6, during the Battle of Nitzanim, Egyptian forces managed to capture the kibbutz of Nitzanim, located between Majdal and Isdud, after the Israeli defenders, who held out for 5 days, finally surrendered. In the intense battles that unfolded, Jerusalem and the road connecting it to Tel Aviv became hotspots of conflict between Jordan's Arab Legion and Israeli forces. A significant moment occurred when Israeli troops, needing to reposition to counter an Egyptian threat, left the Latrun fortress unguarded. The Arab Legion wasted no time in taking over this strategic spot and the nearby monastery, effectively blocking essential supplies from reaching both Israeli fighters and civilians in Jerusalem. The fight to reclaim the Latrun fortress turned into a drawn-out struggle from May 24 to July 18. Despite several attempts, the Israelis couldn't break through the Arab Legion's defenses. During these efforts, Israel suffered significant losses, including 586 casualties. Among those was Mickey Marcus, the nation's first general, tragically killed by accidental friendly fire. The Arab Legion also paid a heavy price, with 90 troops killed and around 200 wounded by the end of May. Jerusalem's dire situation took a turn for the better with the creation of the Burma Road. This makeshift detour, carved out by Israeli forces, was a lifeline that allowed supplies to bypass the blockaded main road. Despite Jordanian efforts to target the road, including sniper attacks and shelling, the visibility challenges and the dedication of the Israeli builders kept the supply chain alive. The first supply convoy successfully made it through on the night of June 1 to 2. Although Jordanian forces managed to inflict casualties, including an attack on June 9 that killed 8 Israelis, the road's completion on June 14 significantly bolstered Jerusalem's position. Even as the road brought much-needed relief, the battlefront remained tense. The Arab Legion successfully fended off an Israeli attack on Latrun and even launched counterattack, briefly seizing Beit Susan and capturing Gezer after intense fighting. However, Israeli resilience shone through as 2 squads from the Palmach, a strike force, recaptured Gezer that same evening, ensuring the vital supply line remained open. The Jordanians, who were in control of Latrun, managed to cut off essential supplies to the western part of Jerusalem, leaving the area in a severe shortage of food, water, fuel, and medicine. Even though a few munitions were dropped into the city from the air, the Israeli forces found themselves in a critical lack of not only food and water, but also ammunition. King Abdullah gave orders to Glub Pasha, the leader of the Arab Legion, to move into Jerusalem on May 17. The Arab Legion didn't hold back, unleashing about 10,000 artillery and mortar shells daily, and also targeted West Jerusalem with sniper attacks. The fight got extremely intense from May 19 to May 28, involving brutal combat from house to house. Ultimately, the Arab Legion managed to force the Israeli troops out of the Arab parts of Jerusalem and also the Jewish quarter in the Old City. During this upheaval, about 1,500 Jews living in the Old City's Jewish quarter were forced to leave, and several hundreds were detained. To prevent them from being attacked by Palestinian Arab crowds bent on violence, the Arab Legion had to escort these Jewish residents out. On May 22, the Arab forces launched an attack on the kibbutz of Ramat Rachel, located just south of Jerusalem. A fierce battle ensued, leading to the deaths of 31 Jordanians and 13 Israelis. Although the defenders of the kibbutz initially withdrew, they managed to regain partial control the next day. The fight over this kibbutz went on until May 26, when it was fully taken back. Another location, Radar Hill, saw similar back-and-forth battles, but ultimately ended up in the hands of the Jordanians on May 26 after a fight that resulted in 19 Israeli and 2 Jordanian casualties. Despite 23 attempts by the Harel Brigade, they couldn't secure a radar hill during the war. On that same day, a tragic incident occurred with the death of Thomas C. Wasson, the U.S. Consul General in Jerusalem and a member of the UN Truce Commission, who was shot dead in West Jerusalem. There was a dispute over whether it was the Arabs or Israelis who were responsible for his death. Later, in mid to late October 1948, the Harel Brigade launched Operation Ha-Har, an offensive aimed at taking control of the Jerusalem corridor, marking yet another significant episode in these series of conflict. Iraqi troops, comprising 2 infantry and 1 armored brigade, initially tried to attack the Israeli settlement of Gesher from northern Jordan, but didn't achieve much success. Following this, they shifted focus toward a strategic area enclosed by the Arab towns of Nablus, Jenin, and Tulkarm. By the 25th of May, they were advancing toward Netanya but got stopped before making any significant progress. A few days later, on the 29th of May, an Israeli counterattack led to 3 days of intense battles around Jenin. Despite the heavy fighting, the Iraqi forces managed to hold their ground. However, after these engagements, the Iraqi troops didn't move much, and their active participation in the war largely concluded. Even with their initial setbacks, the Iraqis managed to take defensive stances around Jenin, Nablus, and Tulkarm, strategically pressuring Israeli forces. During an attempt to push further on the 25th of May, Iraqi forces captured Gulam and reached nearby areas, but the Israeli Alexandroni Brigade quickly halted their progress. An Israeli offensive aimed at capturing Jenin at the end of May faced a tough Iraqi fightback, ultimately failing to achieve its goal. On the northern front, near the Lake of Galilee, Syrian forces entered the scene on the 14th of May with significant military backing. The Syrian president, Shukri al-Quwatli, had clear intentions to eliminate Zionist forces. Faced with a dire weapons shortage, Israel found itself in a precarious position, as admitted by Ben-Gurion. Despite facing a well-equipped Syrian army, local resistance managed to slow down and eventually halt the Syrian advance. Significant was the defense at Kibbutz Degania Aleph, where Syrian tanks were stopped using improvised weapons like Molotov cocktails and grenades, marking Israel's first successful use of artillery in the war. The Syrians had to pull back after failing to break through the kibbutz's defenses. The Syrian army's underestimation of Israeli resolve was considered a key factor in their failure to advance. Meanwhile, the Lebanese army momentarily engaged in the conflict by taking control of al-Malkiyah and Qadas on the 6th of June, but withdrew by the 8th of July, handing over control to the Arab Liberation Army. Syrian forces made another attempt at capturing Mishmar Hayardin on the 6th of June but were pushed back. Although they managed to take the settlement a few days later, they couldn't advance further and shifted to a more defensive stance for the remainder of the conflict. In the midst of ongoing civil unrest starting from 1947, fighting raged between Israeli forces and Palestinian Arab militias, particularly around areas like Lydda, Al-Ramla, Jerusalem, and Haifa. On the 23rd of May, Israeli forces took control of Tentura from Arab forces. A notable event during this period was the death of the Holy War Army commander Hassan Salama on the 2nd of June after a battle with the Haganah in Ras al-Ain. In November 1947, all Jewish aviation resources were consolidated under the Sharut Avir, which began operations from Sde Dov Airport on the outskirts of Tel Aviv in December. This marked the commencement of their aviation effort, with their first operation occurring on December 17th. By March 1948, they had established 2 squadrons, and by May 10th, they had developed a small but organized air operation, despite suffering their first combat loss. When war broke out on May 15th, the Sharut Avir transitioned into the Israeli Air Force, but initially struggled against Arab forces due to their light aircraft. On the same day the war began, Egyptian Spitfires bombed Tel Aviv, including the main airfield at Sde Dov and the Reading power station, killing 5 Israelis. This was part of several attacks over the following hours and days, with an Egyptian aircraft being downed by anti-aircraft fire during these initial raids. Despite ongoing attacks, by May 18th, the Egyptian Air Force had caused significant civilian casualties, including a devastating strike on Tel Aviv's central bus station. Initially, Israel couldn't effectively counter the Egyptian air raids due to the lack of fighter aircraft, which allowed Egypt to attack with little resistance. However, Israel began improving its air defenses in Tel Aviv, leading to higher Egyptian losses, including the accidental downing of 5 Egyptian Spitfires by the British. By the end of May, Egypt's air capabilities were significantly diminished. During the early days of the war, Israel's makeshift air force, despite lacking traditional fighter or bomber planes, conducted night raids on Arab positions, aiming to disrupt even if the impact was minimal. The tide began to turn when Israel acquired Avia S-199 fighters from Czechoslovakia in late May, using these to counter the same British-designed Spitfires used by the Egyptians. The Israeli Air Force was formally established on May 28, 1948, and was bolstered by foreign volunteers and World War II veterans. Israel's first aerial combat victory came on June 3, signaling a shift in the balance of air power. The Israeli Air Force started gaining the upper hand, engaging in more air-to-air combat and achieving air superiority by the fall of 1948. This allowed Israel to take a more offensive stance, targeting Arab air forces more aggressively. In response to enemy attacks, Israel expanded its bombing campaigns to include major Arab cities and infrastructure, even striking the capital of Jordan. However, after a particularly bold raid on Amman, Britain warned Israel against future attacks, leading to a more cautious approach. Throughout the war, the Israeli Air Force's capabilities grew, including the addition of Boeing B-17 bombers. These planes were used to bomb targets in Egypt, showcasing the evolution from a small, improvised force to a more formidable air power. This transformation played a crucial role in shifting the war's dynamics in favor of Israel. As the war began, Israel's navy was just starting, composed of 3 ships previously utilized in the Ali Abed operation and confiscated by the British in Haifa's harbor. These ships were selected because they had a history of military use. One of them, the INS Eilat, was a former United States Coast Guard icebreaker. The other 2, the INS Haganah and INS Wedgwood, had served as corvettes in the Royal Canadian Navy. To prepare these ships without attracting British attention, contractors dressed as dock workers covertly worked on them, ensuring they were seaworthy. On May 21, 1948, disguised as commercial vessels purchased by foreign buyers, these ships set sail for Tel Aviv. There, they were equipped with older, smaller field guns and anti-aircraft weapons. With the British departure from Haifa port on June 30th, Haifa became the principal base for Israel's navy. That October, Israel enhanced its fleet with a submarine chaser acquired from the United States. These vessels were now manned by a diverse crew including former merchant sailors, Aliyah Bet ship crew members, Israelis who had served in the Royal Navy during World War II, and international volunteers. These newly fitted vessels played a crucial role in coastal patrols and targeting Egyptian coastal positions from the Gaza area up to Port Said. In the days that followed, Arab forces only managed to secure small victories against strong Israeli resistance, but were swiftly repelled through Israeli counterattacks. As the conflict continued, the Israeli defense forces significantly outnumbered the Arab troops. In July 1948, the Israeli Defense Forces boasted 63,000 soldiers, a number that would swell to 115,000 by the early spring of 1949. Meanwhile, the Arab forces started with around 40,000 troops in July 1948, grew to 55,000 by October of the same year, and increased slightly by spring 1949. When a truce was put into place, the Israeli Defense Forces held control over 9 significant Arab and mixed cities, including significant locations such as New Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Haifa. Jenin, although not occupied, was left empty as its residents fled. On the other hand, Arab forces managed to capture 14 Jewish settlement points, but only one, Mishmar Hayarden, was located within the area designated for the Jewish state, according to the United Nations Resolution 181. Within the areas allocated for the Jewish state under this United Nations resolution, there were 12 Arab villages that were either resistant to Jewish leadership or had been captured by Arab forces. Additionally, strategic positions like the Lod airport and a pumping station near Antipatris, which fell inside the Jewish state's proposed borders, were controlled by Arabs. The Israeli Defense Forces captured about 50 significant Arab villages outside the Jewish state's proposed borders, along with many smaller hamlets and Bedouin encampments. In terms of land, Arab forces held 350 square kilometers within the proposed Jewish state, while the Israeli Defense Forces controlled 700 square kilometers of the proposed Arab state, excluding the Negev desert, which was not firmly controlled by either side. Regarding casualties, the Syrian army saw 315 soldiers killed and between 400 to 500 injured. The Iraqi force had 200 killed and around 500 injured. The Jordanian Arab Legion suffered 300 fatalities and experienced 400 to 500 casualties, including irregulars and Palestinian volunteers. The Egyptian army lost 600 men, with 1,400 injured, including members from the Muslim Brotherhood. The Arab Liberation Army, rejoining the battle in early June, had around 100 killed or injured. Moreover, Arab forces took 800 Jews as hostages, while the Jews held approximately 1,300 Arabs, mostly Palestinians, as hostages. On May 29th, the United Nations announced a ceasefire that began on June 11th and was supposed to last for 28 days. The aim was to halt fighting without allowing either side to benefit militarily, but both the Israelis and Arabs ended up ignoring the ceasefire's conditions. They both looked for loopholes to strengthen their military position, clearly breaching the ceasefire terms. During this pause in fighting, there was a belief among the British that the Israelis lacked the firepower for significant victories. A British officer in Haifa noted that while Israelis would likely use the break to boost their military preparedness, the Arabs might waste it on internal disagreements. Indeed, Israel did not let this opportunity go by. They managed to bring in a substantial amount of arms from Czechoslovakia, without which, according to Yitzhak Rabin, Israel's future prime minister and then an Israel Defense Forces commander, Israel's ability to continue the fight would have been in doubt. Israel's armed forces grew significantly in number and in firepower during the truce, doubling in manpower and substantially increasing their arms in direct violation of the truce's terms. A notable incident during this period was the Irgun's attempt to smuggle their own weapons into Israel aboard the Altalena ship. Concerned this could lead to a mutiny, Israel's leader Ben-Gurion ordered the ship to be seized. This led to a confrontation where the ship was sunk by Israeli forces, resulting in the loss of lives on both sides. Volker Bernadotte, a United Nations mediator appointed to oversee the ceasefire and work towards a peaceful resolution, along with a team of international military observers, reported multiple serious violations of the ceasefire. These included the Altalena incident, the blockage of aid convoys by Egyptian forces, and issues with water supply to Jerusalem due to actions by Transjordan and Iraqi forces. As Bernadotte pushed for a political settlement, he noted major hurdles including the Arab rejection of any Jewish state, Israel's military-driven expansionist policy, and the growing problem of Palestinian Arab refugees. Bernadotte proposed a new partition plan aiming for a peaceful coexistence between a Palestinian Arab state and Israel, suggesting a union with Jordan, territorial adjustments, and a unique status for Jerusalem and certain ports. Israel was opposed to losing control over Jerusalem and rejected the plan, though they were open to extending the ceasefire. The Arab side rejected both the extended ceasefire and Bernadotte's proposal. On July 8th, just a day before a scheduled truce was set to end, Egyptian troops led by General Mohammed Naguib kick-started the conflict again by attacking Negba. The very next day, Israeli forces responded with a coordinated assault across 3 fronts, stretching from Quneitra to Arish, while Egyptian aircraft targeted Tel Aviv with bombings. Amidst this turmoil, Israeli forces successfully managed to reach several besieged kibbutzim, ensuring they were no longer cut off. This intense period of conflict, marked by fierce battles, lasted for 10 days. It concluded when the United Nations Security Council stepped in on July 18, calling for a second truce. These 10 days saw major Israeli offensive operations and a mostly defensive approach from the Arab forces. Turning to the southern front, here, the Israeli Defense Forces launched numerous attacks, notable among them being Operation Anfar and Operation Death to the Invader. The 11th Brigade's 1st Battalion had a clear objective: capture villages along the southern front. This mission was executed with relative ease due to minimal resistance from the local irregular forces. Amnon Newman, a Palmach veteran, highlighted the lack of resistance from Arab villages in the south, attributing it to dire poverty, inadequate arms, which led to their expulsion following brief engagements, typically ending with an artillery onslaught and subsequent storming of the village. On July 12th, Egyptians made another go at Negba, a site of their prior defeat, employing a larger force, including 3 infantry battalions and an armored battalion. Despite this significant effort, they were once again pushed back, incurring 200 to 300 casualties against the Israelis, 5 dead and 16 wounded. Following this, the Egyptians shifted focus to more isolated targets. An attempt on July 14th to attack Galon was thwarted by minefields and local resistance. Another notable encounter occurred at the less fortified village of Be'erot Yitzhak. Here, the Egyptians initially breached the village defenses, but the inhabitants rallied at a strong defensive position within, holding off the attackers until Israeli Defense Forces reinforcements arrived, reversing the assault. This battle inflicted roughly 200 casualties on the Egyptians and resulted in 17 Israeli fatalities and 15 wounded. This confrontation marked one of Egypt's final offensive moves in the war, as they did not launch attacks on any Israeli villages thereafter. On July 10th, Glub Pasha gave the orders to the Arab Legion defending troops to start what he referred to as a phony war. The most critical offensive by Israel, known as Operation Danny, aimed to secure a broader pathway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. This was to be achieved by taking control of the cities along the road, namely Lod and Ramle. There was also a second phase planned for the operation, which involved capturing the heavily fortified areas around Latrun, situated above the main highway to Jerusalem, and taking over the city of Ramallah. The battle for Hadida, near Latrun, saw Israeli forces emerge victorious, but at the cost of 9 lives. The primary goal of Operation Danny was to extend control to the area east of Tel Aviv and then move inward to assist the Jewish population and forces located in Jerusalem. Lydda became a significant military base, aiding Arab military operations across the region. Ramle, on the other hand, was a key obstacle in Jewish transportation route. Defending Lydda was a local militia of approximately 1,000 people, supported by a group ranging from 125 to 300 from the Arab Legion. In comparison, about 8,000 IDF, Israeli Defense Forces troops, were amassed for the assault on the city, marking this operation as the first to involve multiple brigades. The attack strategy involved enveloping the city from the north and the east. Notably, this was the first time bombers were utilized to bombard a city in the conflict. Lydda was overtaken by the IDF on July 11th. The conflict led to up to 450 Arab casualties and the loss of 9 to 10 Israeli soldiers. The very next day, Ramle was captured. Following the battles, both Lydda and Ramle saw their civilian populations either fleeing or being forcibly expelled to Arab frontline areas. Particularly in Lydda, after facing resistance, the residents were expelled without any transport support, leading to some deaths during the arduous journey under the severe heat of July. Attempts to capture Latrun included an initial attack on July 15th to 16th, which was unsuccessful. A more determined effort was made on July 18th with the Yiftach Brigade, armored with vehicles including 2 Cromwell tanks, but this too failed to achieve its objective. Despite the commencement of a second truce on July 18th, Israeli attempts to take Latrun persisted until July 20th. Operation Kadem was a military plan with the goal of taking control of Jerusalem's old city. However, it didn't get as much support as needed and ultimately did not succeed. This operation was initially set to start on July 8, right after a ceasefire, and was to be led by the Irgun and Lehi groups, but there was a delay. David Shaltiel, possibly doubting their capabilities due to their previous failure at Deir Yassin without the help of the Haganah, postponed the action. Yehuda Lapidot of the Irgun was tasked with breaking through at the new gate. Meanwhile, Lehi aimed to breach the wall from the new gate to the Jaffa gate, with the Beit Horon battalion attacking from Mount Zion. The attack was scheduled for Shabbat at 8 p.m. on July 16, just 2 days before another ceasefire. But things didn't go as planned. The start was first delayed to 11 p.m., then to midnight, and it wasn't until 2:30 a.m. that the fight actually kicked off. The Irgun forces managed to penetrate at the new gate, but the rest of the plan fell through. By 5:45 a.m. on July 17th, Shaltiel called for a retreat and ordered the cessation of hostilities. On July 14, 1948, the Irgun had previously taken control of the Arab village of Malha after intense fighting. The village briefly changed hands following a counterattack, but with Israeli reinforcements it was retaken, though this victory came with the loss of 17 Israeli lives. Switching to another region, the southern Galilee, there was Operation Dekel with aims to take over lower Galilee, including Nazareth. Nazareth fell into Israeli hands on July 16th, and by July 18th, when another ceasefire started at 7 p.m., Israel had captured all of the lower Galilee, extending from Haifa Bay to the Sea of Galilee. And then in eastern Galilee, Operation Brosh was launched, but didn't manage to achieve its aim of removing Syrian forces from the region and the Benot Yaakov Bridge. This operation saw a heavy toll, with 200 Syrians and 100 Israelis losing their lives. At 7 p.m. on July 18th, a second ceasefire came into effect in the conflict, thanks to the hard work of United Nations peacemakers. On September 16th, Count Volker Bernadotte put forward a new proposal to divide Palestine. This plan suggested splitting the Negev region between Jordan and Egypt, with Jordan also incorporating Lydda and Ramle. It envisioned a Jewish state throughout Galilee, drawing the borders to include Fallujah, stretching northeast towards Ramle and Lydda. Jerusalem would become an international city, ensuring local self-government for its Jewish and Arab populations. The plan also aimed to make the port of Haifa and Lydda airport accessible to everyone, guaranteeing the right of return for all Palestinian refugees. Those who opted not to return were to be compensated for their lost properties. The United Nations was to oversee Jewish immigration. However, this proposal was turned down by both involved parties. The day following the proposal, on September 17th, Bernadotte was tragically assassinated in Jerusalem by the militant Zionist group Lehi. In an ambush on Bernadotte's motorcade, both he and a French United Nations observer were killed. Lehi criticized Bernadotte, viewing him as an influencer for British and Arab interests, and thus a significant risk to the then-forming State of Israel. They were concerned that Israel's provisional government might accept his plan, which they believed would be a disaster. Unknown to Lehi, the government had already decided against the plan and planned to return to fighting within a month. Ralph Bunche, an American, stepped in to replace Bernadotte. On September 22, 1948, Israel's Provisional State Council took a major step by passing the Area of Jurisdiction and Powers Ordinance of 1948. This legislation expanded Israel's boundaries by officially annexing the territories captured since the start of the conflict. Furthermore, it established that any future areas captured by the Israeli military would automatically become part of Israel. In the area known as the Little Triangle to the south of Haifa, Arab villagers often attacked Israeli vehicles traveling on the main road from Tel Aviv to Haifa. These attackers were getting supplies from Iraqis in northern Samaria. Even during a period of ceasefire, the second truce, these attacks did not stop. The Israelis tried to push back with attacks on June 18th and July 8th, but they could not overcome the Arab militia who held strong positions. To deal with this, the Israelis started Operation Shatter on July 24th, aiming to secure the main road to Haifa and defeat the enemy forces in that area. Despite initial setbacks on July 24th and 25th, where the Israeli forces faced tough resistance, they eventually broke through the Arab defenses with a powerful combination of infantry, tanks, heavy artillery, and air support. As a result, 3 Arab villages surrendered. Most residents had already run away because of the fighting, and in the days that followed, hundreds were forced to leave. During one of these attacks, Israeli forces targeted Arab retreat paths, resulting in the deaths of 60 Arab soldiers. After the operation, there were claims by Arab sources of a massacre carried out by the Israelis. However, the Israelis denied these accusations, and a United Nations investigation could not find any evidence to support the claims of a massacre. Following this military operation, the road from Tel Aviv to Haifa was reopened for both Israeli military and civilian use. Any obstacles that had been set up along this road were removed. Additionally, the railway service along the coast between Haifa and Hadera was back in operation. Israel launched military operations to push out Arab armies and protect its northern and southern boundaries. In the north, specifically in Galilee, a third ceasefire came into effect on October 22nd. Despite this, irregular Arab forces continued their attacks on Israeli forces and settlements in the north. On that very day, the Arab Liberation Army violated the ceasefire by attacking Manara, capturing the Sheikh Abed stronghold, repelling local Israeli counterattacks, and setting up an ambush for Israeli forces attempting to reach Manara. The Carmeli Brigade of the Israeli Defense Forces suffered loss, 33 killed and 40 wounded. With Manara and Misgavam isolated, Israel's appeals to the United Nations did not result in any action. Then, on October 24th, the Israeli Defense Forces initiated Operation Hiram and quickly took control of the entire Upper Galilee region. They pushed the Arab Liberation Army back to Lebanon and trapped a Syrian battalion in an ambush, completely annihilating it. Under the command of Moshe Carmel and consisting of 4 infantry brigades, the IDF operation lasted just 60 hours. They captured many villages, encountering resistance from locals or Arab forces in some instances. The Arab forces had around 400 killed and 550 captured, while Israeli casualties were comparably lower. There were reports of Israeli forces executing some of the prisoners. Approximately 50,000 Palestinian refugees fled to Lebanon, with some escaping ahead of the advancing Israeli forces and others being expelled from villages that resisted. Conversely, Arabs from villages that did not resist were permitted to stay and became Israeli citizens. The residents of Ikrit and Birim were persuaded by Israeli authorities to leave their homes with a promise of return, a promise that was not fulfilled, as Israel later prohibited their return and offered financial compensation instead, which was rejected. By the end of the month, the IDF had taken control of all of Galilee, expelled all ALA units from Israel, and advanced 8 kilometers, 5 miles, into Lebanon to the Litani River, where they occupied 13 Lebanese villages. In the Hula village, 2 Israeli officers retaliated for the Haifa oil refinery massacre by killing between 35 and 58 prisoners. These officers were later tried for their actions. Israel undertook a series of military operations to push back the Arab armies and establish secure borders for the nation. The decision was made to avoid invading the West Bank due to the large Arab population present there, which Israel felt it couldn't integrate. Instead, attention turned to the Negev Desert, an area seen as ripe for expansion, starting in early October. The goal was to neutralize the Egyptian military presence, as its front lines were seen as too exposed to serve as lasting borders. On October 15th, the Israeli Defense Forces kicked off Operation Yoav in the northern Negev. The mission aimed to split the Egyptian forces positioned along the coast from those near the Beersheba-Hebron-Jerusalem route and to ultimately take control of the entire Negev. This action was particularly urgent due to British efforts to get the Negev assigned to Egypt and Jordan, making it critical for Israeli leaders to secure this region swiftly. Under the command of Yigal Allon and involving infantry and armored brigades, the Israeli forces successfully breached Egyptian lines, which were already compromised by their shallow defenses. The operation resulted in significant Egyptian withdrawals from strategic locations including the northern Negev, Beersheba, and Ashdod. In an instance known as the Fallujah Pocket, Egyptian forces were encircled but held out for 4 months until the 1949 Armistice Agreement facilitated a peaceful handover of the area to Israel. Israeli naval efforts also played a key role, targeting Egyptian coastal installations and preventing naval evacuations. Subsequent operations included Operation Hahar, which began on October 19th in the Jerusalem corridor, and naval engagements off Majdal. These actions led to significant Israeli advances, including the capture of Beersheba and the sinking of the Egyptian flagship Amir Farouk. On November 9, 1948, Operation Shimon was launched to capture the Taggart Fort in Iraq's Suwaidan, achieving success after previous failures. The operation convinced Egypt to abandon several positions in the vicinity. From December 5th to 7th, the Israeli Defense Forces executed Operation Asaf to secure the western Negev, repelling Egyptian counterattacks and ultimately decimating Egyptian forces and tanks with minimal Israeli casualties. Operation Horev, launched on December 22nd, aimed to remove Egyptian forces from the Negev, leading Israel to significant territorial gains and forcing Egypt into ceasefire negotiations. Despite pressure and interventions from both Britain and America, which enforced restrictive rules of engagement on Israel, the ceasefire was achieved in early January 1949. The final operation, Uvda, began on March 5, 1949, to affirm Israeli sovereignty over the southern Negev, concluding with the symbolic raising of the Ink flag at Rashrash, future Eilat, on March 10th, marking the end of the conflict. This gesture indicated Israel's successful claim and the conclusion of the war, establishing control over the crucial southern region. During the conflict, as Israel launched an operation into the Sinai Peninsula, the British Royal Air Force stepped up its game by flying nearly daily spy missions over Israel and the Sinai region. These high-altitude British planes, known affectionately by the Israelis as Shuftikate, would often take off from Egyptian bases, sometimes even flying side by side with planes from the Royal Egyptian Air Force, and they frequently made their rounds over places like Haifa and the Ramat David Air Base. On a fateful day, the 20th of November, 1948, an unarmed RAF de Havilland Mosquito belonging to the 13th Squadron found itself under attack by an Israeli Air Force P-51 Mustang piloted by an American volunteer, Wayne Peake, as it was flying over the Galilee towards Hatzor Air Base. Peake's gunfire hit the Mosquito, setting its left engine ablaze. The plane attempted to escape to the sea, lowering its altitude, only to explode and crash off the coast near Ashdod, resulting in the tragic loss of both the pilot and the navigator. Fast forward to January 7, 1949, 4 RAF Spitfire FR-18s from the 208th Squadron went on a recon mission over the Deir al-Balah area. They stumbled upon an Israeli convoy, freshly attacked by Egyptian Spitfires. Curious, they swooped down to take a closer look, which turned out to be a grave mistake. Israeli ground forces, mistaking them for Egyptian attackers, opened fire, bringing one Spitfire down and lightly damaging another. The situation quickly escalated as 3 of the Spitfires were then ambushed by IAF Spitfires, crewed by volunteers Chalmers Goodland and John McElroy from the US and Canada, respectively. All 3 were shot down, with one pilot meeting a grim fate while 2 others were captured, later to be released or handed over through various means. The drama didn't end there. When 4 more RAF Spitfires, backed by 15 Hawker Tempests, set out to find their lost comrades, they found themselves face to face with IAF Spitfires led by Ezer Weizman, resulting in a fierce skirmish. Despite some of the British planes being handicapped by non-functional weapons or stuck external fuel tanks, the engagement saw one British Tempest shot down and others damaged before the Israelis, realizing the precariousness of their position, withdrew. In the aftermath, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion ordered the wreckage of the downed RAF fighters to be dragged into Israeli territory and buried, a move made in haste and ultimately foiled by RAF reconnaissance photographs. Despite attempts at hiding the evidence, the RAF managed to uncover the truth, leading to heightened tensions. British forces in the Middle East were put on high alert, and the RAF was instructed to treat any Israeli aircraft entering Egyptian or Jordanian airspace as hostile. Additionally, the British took economic measures against Israel, such as hampering fuel supplies, and sought compensation for their losses. Despite the boiling point in relations and expectations of retaliation, RAF commanders ultimately decided against launching retaliatory strikes, de-escalating the situation but leaving a mark on the historical relations between the two nations. Back in 1949, Israel agreed to ceasefires with 4 neighboring countries, first with Egypt on February 24th, then with Lebanon on March 23rd, followed by Transjordan on April 3rd, and finally with Syria on July 20th. Through these agreements, the area that Israel controlled expanded to cover about 3/4 of the land that was previously managed by the British after Transjordan became independent in 1946. This meant Israel ended up with about 1/3 more land than what was originally suggested for the Jewish state in the United Nations' partition plan. After everything was said and done, Israel controlled 78% of what used to be mandatory Palestine, or roughly 21,000 square kilometers, around 8,000 square miles. This included all of Galilee and the Jezreel Valley in the north, the entire Negev Desert in the south, West Jerusalem, and the central coastal plain. The borders established by these ceasefires came to be known as the Green Line. Following these agreements, Egypt took control of the Gaza Strip, and Transjordan took over the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. To keep an eye on the ceasefire, prevent minor incidents from escalating, and support other United Nations peacekeeping efforts in the region, the United Nations set up the Truce Supervision Organization, along with mixed armistice commissions. Right before Israel and Transjordan signed their armistice, a general named Yigal Allon suggested a bold military move to take over the West Bank, all the way to the Jordan River, arguing it would serve as a strong, natural boundary for Israel. However, David Ben-Gurion, another key Israeli leader, turned down the idea. Despite knowing the Israeli military was more than capable of such a conquest, Ben-Gurion was wary about upsetting Western countries, especially wanting to keep on good terms with the United States and avoid angering the British. He believed they had achieved enough wins from the war, and it was time to focus on building the state itself. During the war, Israel faced a significant loss, with 6,373 of its citizens, which was about 1% of its population at the time, losing their lives. Out of these, around 4,000 were military personnel, and the rest were civilians. On the other side, the total number of Arab casualties isn't precisely known. However, it's estimated that around 7,000 Arabs died, including 3,000 Palestinians, 2,000 Egyptians, 1,000 Jordanians, and 1,000 Syrians. Palestinian historian Aref al-Aref in 1958 estimated that the Arab armies combined had about 3,700 fatalities, with Egypt and Transjordan seeing significant losses among both regular and irregular forces. According to Henry Lawrence, a notable point is that the Palestinian casualties were about double those of the Jewish side, totaling approximately 13,000. Out of these, 1,953 were known to have died in combat. 4,004 of these deaths have been recorded with known locations and dates, but without the names of the deceased. Additionally, for 7,043, only the places of death are known, leaving both their identities and the exact dates of their passing a mystery. Lawrence pointed out that a major portion of the Palestinian casualties were non-combatants, happening mainly during successful operations by the Israelis. During the late 1940s, specifically between the Civil War in Mandatory Palestine in 1947 to 1948 and the subsequent Arab-Israeli War, about 750,000 of the roughly 1.2 million Palestinian Arabs living in the area under British control were forced to leave their homes. This mass displacement is referred to by Palestinians as the Nakba, or catastrophe. In 1951, the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine recorded that 711,000 Palestinian refugees had been displaced from what is now Israel, not counting those displaced within Israeli territory itself. The conflict led to the depopulation of over 400 Arab villages and around 10 Jewish villages and neighborhoods, mostly in 1948. Before this turmoil, the Muslim population in Palestine was estimated to be around 1,143,336 in 1947. The reasons behind this mass exodus of Palestinians in 1948 are widely debated by historians. After the conflict ended, about 156,000 Arabs remained within Israel's borders and became Israeli citizens. Those who were displaced, now known as Palestinian refugees, were placed in refugee camps across the Arab world. To assist them, the United Nations created UNRWA, a relief agency dedicated to providing humanitarian aid to these refugees. However, Arab countries have generally refused to integrate Palestinian refugees into their societies, insisting instead that they should be allowed to return to their ancestral homes. This has resulted in Palestinian refugees not only being unable to gain citizenship in most Arab states, but also having their refugee status inherited by their descendants. This policy was encouraged by the Arab League, which advised its member states to deny Palestinian citizenship to preserve their identity and rights to return to their homeland. Today, over 1.4 million Palestinians still live in 58 recognized refugee camps, and more than 5 million Palestinians reside outside of Israel and the Palestinian territories. The issues of Palestinian refugees, their displacement, and the ongoing debate over their right to return continue to be central points of contention in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Between May 1948 and the end of 1951, Israel welcomed 700,000 Jewish settlers, essentially doubling its Jewish population. These new Israelis settled mainly along the country's borders and in areas previously populated by Arabs. A significant portion of these immigrants, over 300,000, came from Asian and North African countries, with the largest group, more than 100,000 people, arriving from Iraq. The rest were primarily from Europe, including 136,000 survivors from the 250,000 displaced Jews of World War II who were living in Germany, Austria, and Italy, as well as more than 270,000 from Eastern European countries like Romania and Poland, with each of these countries contributing over 100,000 immigrants. When Israel was founded, bringing Jews from around the world to the new state was a top priority. The Mossad L'Aliyah Bet played a crucial role by working alongside the Jewish Agency to help organize the journey of immigrants from Europe and the Middle East to Israel. For David Ben-Gurion, one of Israel's founding leaders, the main issue was that Israel didn't have enough Jewish people. Jews left Arab and Muslim countries for many reasons, but the hostility they faced from their local communities intensified after the war. In some places, like Libya and Yemen, the news of victories spurred messianic hope, while the appeal of Zionism and the promise of better economic opportunities and security in a Jewish state encouraged many to make the move. Policies from countries like Egypt at times amounted to holding their Jewish populations hostage. Other pressures, including persecution, political unrest, and violent attacks, influenced the migration. Over the next 30 years, between 800,000 to 1 million Jews left the Arab world, with around 650,000 choosing Israel as their new home. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.